Right. Good afternoon. Alec says we were negative, and we said in all those years when we warned the country get into trouble that the terms negative and positive don't apply to doing high quality strategic analysis, and you must dispense with those in the past and dispense with them for this afternoon. All that matters is whether you can properly anticipate from reading the hard trends and the data and filtering that through what you see from policymakers, what's going to happen next. And we had a very hard time for 15 years because we knew Eskom was going to go up. You could see it. I mean, you just read the annual report. You could understand. We knew the implication for growth, knew the relationship between the country's stability and the growth rate and what would happen to protest levels. And we knew all along that Mr. Ramaphosa wasn't a reformer. And what you get from me this afternoon is the very same methodology. And I have a hard time today because people say this is very positive and can't surely be. You were very fortunate to listen to Bill Johnson. And it happens that some of what I'm going to say probably echoes what he told you, but perhaps not expressed in quite as fine a way. What's probably happening to the country now is a perfectly normal thing, and it's probably going to continue happening, and it's probably going to define what your lives are like in the country for as long as you live, as long as you remain in the country. And it's this that had at any time in really the last 400 years, people within the borders of modern South Africa been able to freely choose who to govern over them, we wouldn't have ended up with large dominant power blocks that determined the rules of the game and all sorts of smaller players that fell in underneath them. It's really, and to some extent, been true for that full 400 years that wherever you lived in the country, there'd probably be one really powerful political actor who could determine what you could do and what the rules were and how to think about problems. And what's happening now is that is coming to an end. And it's probably never going to happen again. And we'll never go back, or we should hope we never go back, because the only way to get back there now would be through populism and state terror, to a position where one dominant actor sits in the union buildings or wherever they happen to sit and rule over us. And to understand why I think that, I'm taking you into a few numbers. The period between 1994 and around 2007 was, on the scoreboard, very successful. After the Asian financial crisis in 1998, the rate of economic growth lifted to 3% and then 4%, and between 2004 and 2007, it maintained a rate of growth, an average of 5%, which is the first time that it happened in the country for that number of years since the first half of the 1960s. And beneath that was rising fixed investment levels that almost touched global fixed investment to GDP rates. And when that happened, the number of people with a job doubled between 1994 and 2007. And you read in the press about the era of jobless growth and how that brought about the demise of Mr. Mbeki. It was completely wrong. And the number of people receiving social welfare grants increased from about 2.5 million in 1994 to about 12 or 13 million by the time he packed up his desk. And you also read about, and that did a vast amount to lift the living standards of people. Chairman of one of the retail groups said to me we could put up a shop anywhere where there was 4 walls and a roof and stock it and customers are out. You read about the failed service delivery of the Mbeki years, and when he came to power essentially as Prime Minister under Mandela in 1994, on the first evening as a democracy, 49% of South African families went to bed without electricity connected to their homes. And when Mr. Mbeki left, that figure had fallen to around 20%. And there are very few emerging markets that could compete with the pace of service delivery improvements that the ANC recorded in its first decade. 10 formal houses were built in that first decade for every one shack that was newly erected. And as a consequence of that, when we went to vote in 2004, the ANC was 6 percentage points stronger than when Mr. Mandela had led it and the country to liberation in 1994. And the reason was the material improvements in the basic living standards of people. But that was probably not in itself sustainable. But we never came to test that because we had the confluence of the global financial crisis and the Polokwane conference of the ANC, and the outlook for the country changed completely. And fixed investment levels fell away and growth fell away with that. And whereas when Mr. Mbeki left office, I think there were 14.5 million people, 15 million people going to work. Today, the figure is 16.2 million, created almost no jobs. The share of families without electricity is higher now than it had been then, and real per capita GDP has been falling for the better part of a decade. And as that happened, there's myth that the ANC can govern like this forever. There's no consequence. ANC voters just vote for a time after time. It's nonsense, never been true. There is a very short lag time between poor governance here and an immediate negative political reaction for the party governing the country. Countries, in fact, changed extremely quickly over the past 20 years. In 2004, the ANC and its kind of ideological allies would have commanded almost 80% of the votes in the country. And in this, and the sort of DA types under 20. I think the DA got 12 in that election. Freedom Front, others as well, but 12. In this next election, the ANC and its ideological allies aren't quite going to touch 60, and the sort of DA and its allies are going to touch 40. So 80 versus 20 has become 60 versus 40, and that is lightning fast political change. And if you drill deeper into the country, you make the change rate so fast that it might even be too fast, and we must be careful, as Bill correctly warned you, what you wish for when you talk about getting rid of the ANC, but you're not quite sure what you're going to replace it with. In urban areas, we split the country into halves, an urban and a rural half, and they had separate elections. In rural South Africa, in urban South Africa, the ANC would now get 30%. The DA is bigger, just on numbers, than ANC there. In rural South Africa, the ANC is probably at double that, 66 or so. But that rural bloc is an older bloc, black people who obviously grew up as such in rural South Africa during apartheid. And that frame of reference is strong enough that a little bit of load shedding, 9 days without water, as Johannesburg has suffered through, not enough to move the dial. But find a person who doesn't have that living memory experience of the old regime, and what the polling is unambiguous about is where contemporary challenges override historical experience, support for the ANC disappears. And if you factor the mortality rate onto the older rural voting demographic and play that out over just 5 years, you take the ANC's current 40, and that's not a forecast of where it will end. It can go up and down still before 29 May. We'll take that 40 to closer to 30 or perhaps to 20. And what this all means, and it's a very good thing, so I'm really talking, and I'm going to continue, about countervailing forces in favor of the country's success, is the political system is working exactly as it was designed. It was designed to ensure that if we ever reached a point where the country wasn't well governed to the advantage of all its people, they would become the reform movement. So you don't need to look to business or Americans. Will they do something? Will someone do something? People are far advanced in terms of bringing about change. And that means there's a natural immunity built into our political system, which means we are in the fortunate minority of post-colonial emerging markets in Africa or South America. When they reach the end of that first political generation after colonial rule, will probably be able to change fairly peacefully into a new political dispensation that reflects the fractured social strata of our society. And that's what's going to happen to us now. And we can never go back against that unless we become a fascist autocracy. So the politics is working out exactly as it should, and you can be very grateful that it's chaotic and a bit shambolic, and politicians argue with each other here. That the leader of the opposition is not in prison. And we're having this meeting in Hampstead talking about whether anyone's heard of John from when last. He's hanging in a dungeon under the Union buildings by his toenails. We're not that at all. And we're not likely to go through a violent change process. So don't do the South African thing of the state of the country is about the worst thing that has ever happened to any society in the history of all things, and that the end is upon us. System's working. Second thing I want to tell you is that where the state retreats, there's another countervailing force. If you do a trend line of all the electricity produced in South Africa over the last 50 years, and you split that into what is produced by Eskom and the state and what is produced by something that's not Eskom or the state, that crocodile has started opening its mouth, if you can imagine the chart, towards the end of the chart. As Eskom production has started to stall, private production has started to fill the gap, and it's not the solution entirely in of itself to get us back to 5% growth, but it's certainly mitigated the damage. You see another crocodile chart, divergence, when you look at what's freight carried on South Africa's railway line, which has been falling away, and what's carried privately on the roads, which is again not the solution in the longer run, and certainly mitigated the effects. And the most stunning such statistic is this. A definition of a modern state, the reason we all departed from a state of anarchy and decided to submit ourselves to some authority, is that we surrendered the monopoly on the use of violence or force to the state. That's a state definition, a good state definition. In 1994, there was one policeman in the country for every 360 people. And there was also, it's almost the same, one policeman for one security guard for every 360 people. Today, there's one policeman in the country for every 430 people, but one private security officer for every 110. So the monopoly on the use of force has already been surrendered by the state 20 years ago. And if you give that up, then anything goes. Private entry, state failure draws in private entry. It's been on a small and sporadic scale, but if we get into a chaotic coalition conflagration after this, a client of mine that mined said to me, would the coalition bring about better mining policy? And I said, absolutely not. Cannot, because no one there knows the first thing about mining or how you mine or what you do. But the chaos of no one having quite 50% and arguing with each other about what to do create vast opportunities for you as a private actor to get in. And so while you're arguing about who's going to run the Johannesburg Parks Committee, sign this that lets us take over operational control of the railways, a process already fully in train, and one that may accelerate. And that's a mitigating factor and a countervailing force. Third one, so I said the political system works. Secondly, we've got this private response to things that helps. Opinion in the country is completely moderate. It's complete nonsense what you read in the traditional mainstream media. But a country divided against itself, racked with conflict, on the verge of detonation. 85% of voters, this is quite new stuff, would support scrapping all racial criteria in state procurement policy. Labour reforming labour market regulations, if that would make job creation easier, the same almost. Scrapping the minimum wage splits 50-50 in the ranks of ANC voters. Devolution of authority downwards, so that lower levels of government should take control, 60% in favour. The opposition should get together to remove the ANC from power, 70% of people, and amongst ANC voters, 51%, for the reasons that Bill mentioned to you. That ANC voters do not have a fundamental problem with the DA. If you test that in detail, focus group it a bit, that to make it sort of accurate, is they think DA voters are these kind of weird whites that arrived on ships 400 years ago and lived in Hermanus and country clubs, but they don't begrudge one that. The question of, would it be better if all the whites just went away? Only 13% of South Africans think that would be a solution to the country's problems, and 80% strongly oppose the idea. So ANC voters don't have a fundamental problem with the DA, and DA voters are also pretty in favour of doing a deal with the ANC later on, because at a deep level they feel that's crossing some kind of Rubicon, and then they sort of start to belong to the country. So the political system works where private sector steps in where the state fails, and opinion is not radicalized. This isn't Gaza, which is a terrible problem because of radicalized opinion on the ground. This is moderate and sensible and pragmatic opinion for the time being. Another one I'll give you is that, well, what you should do now if you're the ANC on the brink of defeat, and Bill's numbers apparently on the weekend will tell you they're at 40%. What you should do if you're an ex-Soviet domiciled East German house, post-colonial liberation movement is print money. Because you must now create inflation. Because inflation will cause desperate poverty. And desperate poverty you can turn into populism and anger, and you can do an end run around constitutional provisions and the election system and cling to power. And despite that, and a little bit of cheating in this last budget, but very small, the minister, with the support of the cabinet, is allowing the expenditure to revenue line to follow the expenditure, state expenditure to GDP line, to track the revenue to GDP line sideways. And you should be immensely grateful for that, because if we turn to printing, then you can radicalize a population. Then you're trying to do a run to overcome the effects of the political system. The ANC chaps en masse, and there's some very dangerous people. I'm not trying to do that at this point. When he resigned from politics this morning, our friend Rob said to you, sat next to me for a cup of coffee, that corporate cash on deposit in South African banks has now reached a figure approaching 1.5 trillion rand. You don't need to do vast tax increases. The capital base to start some of the economic recovery already exists within the country, within its own banks. It only needs some confidence to free it. There's another capital base which lies in the South Atlantic Ocean, and its value rests in the immense geostrategic importance now of that piece of water. Because if the Americans cannot confront the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, which they've lost the ability to do, they want to confront Chinese expansion, they can try to do that at Malacca. But if they lose that, the next choke points are Hormuz and Bab al-Mandab, and then you're on the African East Coast. And before you know it, you're at the naval base in Simonstown. And if you lose that, as an American general told Congress 2 years ago, and the Chinese set up an outfit off Africa's west coast, perhaps at Bata in Equatorial Guinea, he said to the congressman, sort of a proper general, so he said to them, this is not somewhere to get gas and groceries for the Chinese. This is a base where they can re-equip with munitions and repair their vessels. And sailing from Bata, the Chinese Navy is closer to New York than had it had a base in Hawaii. And unbeknownst to many South Africans, with exceptions, the media has dumbed the country down to painful extent. If we play off our geostrategic position under a future coalition government, the trade, etc., concessions we can extract together with what's already on deposit in the country's banks is the capital base to start to rebuild. And the last point I'll make for you on countervailing forces is that unlike many post-colonial societies that got into deep trouble, which we're in, we have enclaves. And the middle classes have retreated, some of them, others have left. Some have retreated into enclaves. Hermanus is an enclave. The Western Cape is an enclave. And that means that the skills base to rebuild hasn't exited completely, because there's an option to remain. Technology allows that, and the good sense of the government to allow you to park a share of your wealth offshore just in case this kind of briefing turns out to have been grossly naive. You're not going to be wiped out, but you're still here, so you could bring that money back. And the last thing I'll say to you is this, that if you take these points together that I've given you, and there are others, but we run out of time, it's very hard from them to draw the conclusion that we are now on the brink of the final collapse, and doom is our future. And this is very much the end. And despite the 400 years we've been here together with colonial expansion and frontier wars and the Boer War and the rebellion in 1914 and the First and Second World Wars and Sharpeville and Soweto and the transition in 94, and that this election is the one at which we'll finally turn out the lights. I think on the balance of probabilities, that's unlikely. I think the country is more strongly positioned than it was 5 or 6 years ago. And even if you dispute this, which you're welcome to, but you must be skeptical of analysts, for the downside people, they have to admit that the position is more finely balanced now, at the very least, than the dire downside analyses tend to suggest. Alec, thank you.